This is WFYI News Now. It's February 6th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, state lawmakers want to create a fund to help families pay for adoptions. Legislation that would put limits on when and how insurance companies managing the state's Medicaid plans can deny emergency physician service claims. And the Trump administration is ramping up efforts to deport immigrants who are in the country illegally.
I think if Indiana isn't the state that challenges it, that another state will, and we will see this issue come back before the court before long, sooner or later.
Those stories coming up, but first. Protests were held at state capitals across the country Wednesday to oppose Project 2025 and the Trump administration. WFYI's Jeremy Rubin reports on the gathering in Indianapolis.
Opposing the involvement of unelected billionaires like Elon Musk in federal politics was one focal point of the protest. Another issue, the Trump administration's embrace of conservative legislation, which many have connected to the Project 2025 initiative. Christian Hess, an organizer for the protest, has a message for Indiana lawmakers with similar legislative goals.
It seems to be the initiative of this administration for quick wins, and I can understand and acknowledge the desire to enact fast change out of frustration, but the consequences of that are people get hurt and things do not work correctly.
Hess says he estimated 250 to 300 people showed up to the protest. I'm Jeremy Rubin.
Families who adopt children out of foster care in Indiana face potentially significant expenses that the state's $2,000 adoption payment doesn't cover. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports state lawmakers want to create a fund to help families cover those costs.
Republican Representative Julie McGuire says she wants to make adoptions more accessible by removing some of the financial obstacles that families face.
Many children in foster care have experienced trauma or have special needs. This additional opportunity for financial assistance can help cover extra services such as additional therapies, counseling, or specialized education.
McGuire's bill would put $25 million into an adoption fund, and she says it would also create $18.5 million in tax credits for donations to the fund.
Just start incentivizing a family and donors to give to this fund.
A House committee unanimously approved the bill, sending it to the House's fiscal panel, the Ways and Means Committee. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the Statehouse.
Emergency physicians often order tests or lab work to rule out serious concerns when treating patients. Insurance companies sometimes refuse to reimburse for that care based on the final diagnosis. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports a Senate committee approved legislation to put limits on when and how insurance companies managing the state's Medicaid plans can deny emergency physician service claims.
The bill applies what's known as a prudent layperson standard, which requires insurance companies to provide coverage for emergency care based on symptoms, not the final diagnosis. So, for example, an emergency physician may give a patient with chest pains an x-ray, even if the final diagnosis was something like indigestion. Dr. Daniel Elliott is with the Indiana chapter of American College of Emergency Physicians. He says it's been frustrating and disheartening trying to get reimbursed for the care emergency physicians provide.
We treat and evaluate regardless of what shows up, what complaint it is, and without thought for reimbursement.
Indiana Medicaid has a list of services on what is referred to as an autopay list for emergency care. Under the bill, insurers would not be able to deny claims solely because they are not on that list. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
The bill now heads to the Senate Appropriations Committee for consideration. And for our final story today, the Trump administration is ramping up efforts to deport immigrants who are in the country illegally. But public schools are required to provide all children, regardless of their immigration status, with an education. From WFYI's Education Desk, Lee Gaines spoke with a legal expert about immigrant students' rights and how those rights could be challenged.
A 1982 Supreme Court ruling says it's unconstitutional to deny immigrant students, including those without legal status, a free education. But Nicole Hallett, a law professor at the University of Chicago, says she expects this ruling to be challenged, and the current Supreme Court, with its conservative majority, will be asked to once again consider the constitutional rights of immigrant students.
I'm quite worried that when this case gets to the Supreme Court, that we may see a very large change in how we think of public education in this country.
Proposed Indiana legislation would allow schools to refuse enrollment to immigrant students they believe are in the country illegally. The bill hasn't received a hearing, and it's unclear if it will, but if it becomes law, a legal challenge is almost certain. I'm Lee Gaines.
You can find a more in-depth breakdown of immigrant student rights at WFYI.org/news. And that's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Daudelin and Zach Bundy, with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal-Estes. Kendall Antron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.